The European exploration and settlement of the Western Hemisphere is known as the Age of Discovery, and it's a period that runs from about the 15th through the 18th century. And this coincides with a period in European history known as the Early Modern Period. And this was a period when the Europe of today was beginning to take shape. So the world's beginning to look like the world that we can recognize today. So real briefly, what are the elements of early modern Europe? Now, as we'll see, each one of these elements was a factor, a motivating factor that led Europeans to explore and colonize the New World. So in order, we're going to discuss, first of all, the capitalism and the emergence of a middle class. We're going to look at the rise of nation states in Western Europe. We're going to examine the Renaissance and the Reformation. And each one of these factors would result in a motivation for the Age of Discovery. So let's begin by looking at capitalism and the growth of capitalism and the growth of the middle class in Europe. During the Middle Ages, you basically essentially had two classes in Europe. You had a landed aristocracy, who were the elite, and then you had a mass of agricultural laborers who were labeled peasants. But beginning around 1050 AD, there emerged yet a third class of people who made their living by buying and selling and producing goods. And this would be the middle class. And this class often lived in towns because that's where commerce took place. And so often they're referred to as the bourgeoisie because bourgeoisie is a word derived from an ancient German word for town. So what these merchants did, they were the wealthiest members of the middle class, and they made a lot of their money by trading in what we call luxury goods. Now, a luxury good is a good that by owning that good, it gives you a sense of social prestige and a sense of honor and raises your status. In today's world, for example, you can get from A to B in a Toyota, but if you get from A to B in a Mercedes, man, you're somebody. People can say, oh, look, that guy owns a Mercedes. So that's why a Mercedes is what we call a luxury car. Now, in this period, on the eve of the Age of Discovery, there are certain goods that by owning them gave you, the wealthy wanted to have these goods because it gave them prestige. Silk from China, elaborate spices from India and the Far East. Owning these goods, possessing these goods would give you prestige and power and influence. Later on in history, as the Age of Discovery proceeded and new goods were discovered, goods like sugar and cocoa and coffee and tobacco were regarded as luxury goods. Now, we don't consider when you smoke a cigarette, drink a cup of coffee, and eat a chocolate-covered donut, you don't think of yourself as having a great social class. But 300, 400 years ago, being able to have access to those goods was a luxury. And that's where the real money was in the Age of Discovery. That's why you had merchants who were willing to find new markets and new routes to find these goods and bring these luxury goods to Europeans and make lots of money, make lots of profit in the process. So that was the rise of merchants and capitalism would be one factor in motivating people to make voyages to discovery. Okay, another development of the early modern period was the rise of nation states in Western Europe. Now, you got to remember that back in the Middle Ages, kings operated in a system known as feudalism. And basically, kings expected certain obligations from the landed aristocracy. The obligations went both ways. But what we find is in the later Middle Ages, about the 14th and into the 15th centuries, aristocrats were not fulfilling their end of the bargain. And they wanted more autonomy and independence. And the result was that you often had these wars that pitted the aristocracy against the king. So you had a situation where you had certain kings by the 15th century who were looking for ways to defeat the feudal aristocracy and to assert their power. And what they all shared in common, these kings, was that they rallied the support of the common people, and that's where you get the idea of a nation. These rulers were appealing to the people at large, the nation, and relying on this beginning of nationalism to build up political support so they could defeat this challenge by the aristocracy. Now, I'll just give you a couple examples. One early nation state was Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella, when they married each other in the 15th century, they united their two separate kingdoms of Aragon and Castile and created the modern nation of Spain. And by uniting their forces, they were able, and their resources, they were able to get the best of the local aristocracy. Another example is Henry VII of England. And he lived at a time when there were constant wars and power struggles. It was known as the War of the Roses. Now, eventually, Henry VII was able to defeat his rivals and to assert royal power, and he did it in the same way that Ferdinand and Isabella did it in Spain, by appealing to the nation at large, especially the rising middle class, and winning their support. And because many members of the middle class, they were tired of war and violence, and they saw a strong nation state and the rule of a king as a way of protecting their investments, of maintaining law and order and peace and trade. Another example would be Louis XI of France, often known as the Spider, because he was always weaving intrigues, webs of intrigue like a spider. And he also had a long-term battle with powerful aristocrats, but he too welcomed the support of the middle class and won their support. So monarchs, with the support of the middle class, were able to eventually overcome these obstacles and assert a strong nation state, a strong central government in their nations. Now, these monarchs were quick to see that since the merchants had helped them, they wanted to help the merchants. So what we see happening is that these strong rulers, these kings, these monarchs, were willing to support voyage of exploration because they saw these voyages as a way to benefit the people who supported them, the merchants, and also find a new source of revenue through customs duties and taxes. So it's not a coincidence that these strong nation states all were located along the Atlantic Ocean, because they were the ones who saw voyaging across the Atlantic in search of new trade routes as a way of benefiting the merchants who had supported them and potentially creating another source of tax revenue. Next, we're going to look at another development of the early modern period, and that's the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is a cultural movement. Renaissance, as the French word, means rebirth. And normally when we think of the Renaissance, we think of great artists. We think of great painters and sculptors. And one aspect of the Renaissance was that Renaissance artists were trying to study and reproduce the glory that was ancient Greece and Rome. You know, the painting, the sculpture of the architecture of Greece and Rome. They wanted to reintroduce that and model their own work on that. But it's important to remember that the Renaissance was not just about art. It was also, there were people called humanists who were in love with the work of Greek and Roman poets and philosophers and scientists. And these humanists, they would go in search of ancient manuscripts that recorded the works of ancient Greek and Roman scientists and philosophers and poets. And they would collect these works, study them, and make sure that they were published. You know, around 1453 or so marks the beginning of the introduction of the printing press to Europe. And as a result of the printing press, these works of ancient Greek and Roman scientists and philosophers, they could be reproduced on a massive scale. And this had the effect of promoting literacy and learning across Europe. So what does all this have to do with an age of exploration? Well, at the same time that the age of exploration got started, you had more and more educated people, some aristocrats, some middle class, who were excited because of their study of Greek science. They were excited about learning more about the world. So the prospect of discovering ancient early peoples and plants and animals from across the seas, this was something that excited and generated a lot of enthusiasm at this particular time period. So the Renaissance was a motivating factor in part for many of these voyages of discovery that took place. Now, another major aspect of the early modern period is the Reformation. Now, the Reformation is a religious movement. And one of the developments that occurred as a result of the Renaissance with the increase in literacy and learning is that there were many people who began to, at this time, challenge some of the teachings and doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. And some of these critics believed that the Roman Catholic Church had veered away from pure Christianity, the Christianity of the first disciples. And these people, they wanted to purify the church and to make it like the church of the early centuries of the Christian era. And so many of these critics decided that the Roman Catholic Church was so corrupt and had veered so far away from the original message of Christ that they broke away and formed new Protestant churches. So as a result of this wave of religious revival and this new critique of the Catholic Church, we see the emergence of a number of different Protestant denominations. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. The guy who got the ball rolling was a former German monk named Martin Luther. And through his study of Scripture, he began to question some of the doctrines of the Catholic Church that he didn't think were based on the New Testament or the Old Testament. For example, the concept of purgatory, the idea that before a saved person could enter into heaven, they had to go to a place called purgatory where they had to be purified of their sins before they entered heaven. Well, Martin Luther could find no evidence of the concept of purgatory in the New Testament. Therefore, he didn't think that that was a valid doctrine to be teaching. And that was just one reason that he broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. He also believed very strongly that people ought to read the Bible in the language, their own language. And in this particular day, the language of the Roman Catholic Church was Latin, which was a dead language. It was a language only of churchmen and scholars. So what Martin Luther did was to authorize the first translation of the Bible into a vernacular language, his language, German. So he would be one of the first great Protestant reformers. Now, another very influential reformer, especially in American history, was a man by the name of John Calvin. John Calvin was French, and he agreed with many of the ideas of Martin Luther, but he had some further criticisms. For example, he didn't believe that the church hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church was biblical. So he wanted to go to a model where every church was independent, a congregational church model. He also didn't approve of rituals or liturgies within the church, within a church meeting. He thought that a church meeting should be about spontaneous prayer and the study of Scripture and the singing of psalms, not rituals and liturgy and set prayers. Now, John Calvin and Luther rejected many of the doctrines and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and were leaders of new Protestant churches. But the Roman Catholic Church, they responded to this situation with what is often called the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation. And the Catholic Reformation was not so much about changing their doctrines or teachings. It was about cleaning up corrupt practices which had been a source of criticism among many Christians, such as the corruption of the clergy. So as a result of the Catholic Reformation, what we see is that the Catholics became just as enthusiastic and filled with a desire to promote their teachings as the Protestants. So what does this all have to do with the Age of Discovery? Well, first of all, as a result of the Reformation, you had, and by the time you get to the 16th century especially, you had Protestants and Catholics who were very evangelical, who were very insistent that when they met the new peoples of the New World, that they bring them the light of their faith. So there was a kind of a competition between Catholics and Protestants to spread their faith and their church to the new peoples. Now, another factor in especially the settlement of the New World was that in Europe you didn't have freedom of religion. You see, there was a tradition that one goal of the king or the ruler was to make sure that everybody followed the correct religion. So Catholic monarchs wanted all of their subjects to be Catholic. Protestant monarchs wanted all of their subjects to belong to their church, their version of the Protestant faith. That meant that if you lived in an area where you practiced a different religion than the religion of the monarch, you were subject to persecution. You could be imprisoned. You could even be put to death. You could be burned at the stake. And that was a common way of executing heretics, people who went against the teachings of the correct church. So as a result of this situation, the New World, and especially what would become the American colonies, often became a refuge for people who were subject to persecution and felt persecuted in their European country, who hoped that by moving to the New World, they could find a new life where they could practice their religion without fear of imprisonment or death. So those are the main factors. These developments in early modern Europe were factors in the colonization and the exploration of the New World. And our next task and our next lesson will be to actually look at the exploration of the New World and look at the main figures in the Age of Discovery.